This is the first in what we hope is a frequent lecture series. We're calling it the Nashua Lyceum Lecture Series, named after the Lyceum of the 1800s. Nashua was one of the first cities in the state to have a lyceum before 1830. That was the major form of entertainment back then in education, and we are looking forward to hosting many interesting and informative lectures here at the Hunt again. This has been a dream of Trustee Marilyn Solomon for many years, and we're happy she's here for the first one and hope to see her at all of them. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Bob Sampson, who's going to be our speaker today. He is the chair of the Nashua Historic District Commission, and that's where I first heard many of his stories, also being on the commission, and knew that he's a wonderful storyteller. He's been with the Historical Society for years, a Nashua resident of all his life, and a real fun person to listen to. So let's all welcome Bob.
Judy, I have to make a correction. Yeah. I haven't lived here all my life. I'm not dead yet. Can you folks out in the lobby there hear me? Wave you. If you can't, wave or indicate, and I'll shout louder. As I said, I'm not dead yet, so I haven't lived here all my life, but I was born in Nashua in 1932. I'm getting signals they can't hear me. Okay, I was born in Nashua in 1932, and to start off, just talk a little bit about Nashua as it was in the 1930s. I see a few of you here who might remember that far back, but I see an awful lot more who are just young folks, young kids, don't know anything about Nashua in the old days. Nashua, when I was a child, had a population of about 30,000. It's triple that now. You can't imagine the changes that have occurred over the last almost 80 years. I'd like to read just for a minute to set the stage or the style of that period from the Mayor's annual report for the year 1932. That was Mayor William F. Sullivan, who, amongst other things, happened to be my near neighbor down at the south end of Nashua, but who also had a full-time job as president of the Pennychuck Water Works. I'm not sure what he would think of the fact that the city now owns it. In any case, he wrote in his annual message about the labor situation in that Depression year, "No longer can the administrator of welfare funds tell the applicant to go get a job, for there are no jobs." On a lighter note from the same report, he said, "There is one job of major importance which confronts the state, and that is the improvement of the Daniel Webster Highway from Lawndale, so-called." Who knows where Lawndale is? Okay, few people. Basically, that's the south end of Nashua, approximately in the area of the Evergreen Cemetery, Fields Grove, that area. In fact, there was a ballpark down there, and the trolley cars before my time, but trolley cars used to go almost there. I think someplace there's a picture that shows to the ball game, shows a trolley car coming down Library here. In any case, the major job confronts the state, improvement of the Daniel Webster Highway from Lawndale, so-called, to the Massachusetts line. This is where it gets interesting. Whether it will be reconstruction of the existing highway, which is now South Main Street down by Riviere College, or the addition of the acquisition of an additional high-speed scenic boulevard, rests in large measure with the State Highway Department. Those of you who know the DW Highway South today, I don't think you can quite imagine it as a scenic high-speed boulevard. As a first grader, I watched that being built they started laying it at the corner of Montgomery Avenue on Main Street and went on down to the Massachusetts line. And the gravel for it came out of what us kids in that area regarded as our gravel pit off Catherine Street, which is now all covered with houses. But they dug a load of gravel out there and disturbed a bunch of blueberry patches that had been very dear to us. A few other recollections from the 1930s. I remember seeing Crown Hill shortly after the fire, the Great Fire of 1930, when the large part of Crown Hill was foundations and chimneys, houses that had burned out in the fire, and because of the Depression, nobody had had any money to rebuild them. Another thing I remember from those days was going skating on the South Common. Anybody know where the South Common was? Okay, one or two. Well, it's now buried under the Elm Street Junior High School. Before the school was built, that was the South Common, pretty much like the North Common. And they flooded it in the winter, and we went skating there. We also, down off the East Dunstable Road, plugged up Salmon Brook. There was a culvert under the East Dunstable Road, and we would plug it up in the fall or in the winter, and the water would rise nearly up to the level of East Dunstable Road, and that made a great skating rink, and the city didn't like us very much. The picture in the paper showed me as a child. Some people have alleged that was a picture taken by the great Civil War photographer Matthew Brady. He didn't quite make it into that. Actually, Louis de Geer came over from France and took the picture. But the garage in that picture blew away in the 1938 hurricane, and I remember coming home from school that day. It was a nice day, but as the afternoon wore on, the wind began to blow and it got darker and darker. The lights went out, and we sat in our dining room window and watched that garage just begin to disintegrate. The doors started flapping, one wall fell in, the roof finally just lifted and blew off across a field. And but the next morning it was nice, and my mother said I should go to school. We walked to school in those days. We didn't have buses. So we walked, my little friend and I walked up the East Dunstable Road as far as Main Street, and in the process climbed over about 18 fallen trees, and a lot of power wires down, and no cars going anywhere. So we turned around and came home, and I said to my mother, I don't think there's any school today. You want to understand, this was before internets, TV, the telephone was all out. So she said, well, you can stay home today. Well, it turned out I stayed home for over a week because of the fact that the school, there was no power, the streets were plugged, and so forth. And I remember at the same time thinking how strange it was to write on a school paper 1940 instead of 1939. Seemed very strange. Well, barely had all of that happened before the war came to us. I remember we were getting ready to have Sunday dinner. We just bought a new radio, and my mother said, Bobby, go in the living room and turn on the radio. Maybe we can have some music while we have dinner. Well, we never did have dinner because the radio was full of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And of course that shortly led to rationing, and I've got, if we can look at them a little later on, some of our old ration books and a permit that my father had to get to go on a, quote, vacation trip, unquote, which was to go up to Wolfboro to get me out of summer camp at the end of my 2 weeks there. It required an official approval by the local rationing board to allow him to take a vacation trip. And it was very strange for us kids in Nashua to see an out-of-state number plate. Where did they get the gas to do that? Once in a while, somebody from Massachusetts, but Vermont, Rhode Island, oh, they must be cheating on the rationing. It was also wonderful in that there were so few cars on the street that we could ride our bicycles everywhere. And we did. And some of you who know the East Dunstable Road, I see one person there who knows it well. Long Hill, which in those days was a gravel road, and I had a bicycle with a speedometer on it, of which I was very proud. So one time I pedaled all the way down there up to the top of this gravel road, Long Hill, which in those days were farms, dairy farms, and so forth on both sides of it. Started down the hill, pedaling as fast as I could, and I got up to 40 miles an hour on a bicycle. Came home and told my father what I'd done, and he said, "That's great, never do it again." Then we got to the end of the war, and the Nashua changed greatly. We had all grown up with the Nashua Manufacturing Company, as where if you didn't work there, you worked in one of the shoe shops. But Nashua Manufacturing was the largest employer, the biggest taxpayer, one of the biggest cotton textile mills in New Hampshire, and by far the largest cotton blanket mill in the world. Well, it closed, and we just could not imagine that Nashua was not going to blow away, disappear. Everybody was concerned. The city did a marvelous job of rescuing the economy. But I do have to tell one story about right at the end of the war and just before the mill closed and so forth. Christmas 1945, Nashua had always had Christmas street lighting, which we do now, but we hadn't had it during the war because of blackouts and electricity shortages and so forth. So we're going to have Christmas street lighting for Christmas 1945, the first time since 1940. Well, John L. Lewis took the coal miners out on strike. There was a coal shortage. Most electricity was generated by coal-fired power plants, so it looked like we wouldn't have it. Well, some of the folks at the Nashua Manufacturing Company came up with the idea that, gee, we've got a couple of old DC generators and some gasoline engines, and we could probably generate enough power for the Christmas street lighting. So the machine shop made the appropriate pulleys, the belt shop made the appropriate belts. My father, who was an electrician in the mill, worked on it. And we got to the evening where the lights are going to be turned on. And I have to tell you a little background. Growing up in my father's house, I can't remember the time when I didn't know how to make extension cords or change fuses or do things like that. So there was a large gathering in an alley off High Street where the generators were set up and the wires were out onto Main Street and so forth. And there was going to be a turning on the lights ceremony, and the mayor was there and a bunch of the aldermen and so forth. So I had been roaming up and down Main Street looking at the wiring and so forth. And I came into the alley and grabbed my father's sleeve and said, "Dad, Dad, some of the wires aren't connected to these generators." "Yeah." "Dad, some of the wires are still connected to public service." Well, another one of the people in the electrical department, who happened also to be an alderman, turned to my father and said, "George, tell the boy to shut up. The mayor doesn't know we're still running part of it off public service." And I won't mention any names because one of the descendants of that alderman is here. So the mill was being closed, and I was in high school, and we had the exciting time of having a Senate hearing, an actual United States Senate committee hearing on the stage of the high school auditorium. Senator Tobey brought a subcommittee of the Senate Commerce Committee here to talk to Royal Little, the head of Textron, about the closing of the mills. Well, that was wonderful because all of the history classes and economics classes and so forth in high school got to go in the auditorium and listen to the hearing. So that was great. We gathered in the auditorium and saw an actual, real United States Senate hearing. Another thing that happened with personal experience in those years, we had a lot of trains to Boston. There were probably at least 10 or a dozen trains a day going through Nashua in each direction, going down to Boston. And my mother let me do something that I can barely imagine any mother allowing today, but she would give me $3 or $4, maybe $5 if I was lucky, and I would walk down to the Nashua Union Station, take the train to Boston, get out, walk down Canal Street, through Scollay Square, down to the Boston Common and so forth, buy a bag of peanuts, feed the squirrels, walk down to the waterfront, look at the ships, also pay a nickel to the Boston Elevated Street Railway, the L as they called it, and see if I could ride to every stop on the system without paying another nickel. And that was how I learned about Boston. And at the end of the day, I would go to North Station and take the train back to Nashua. Now, the train service between Nashua and Boston took, including a stop at Lowell, scheduled running time, and they usually made it, was 47 minutes. Try that in your car today. There were, and this is a little before my time, but we had 5 railroad stations in Nashua. I'm talking about trains, so I'll mention railroad stations. There was the Nashua Union Station down by, I was going to say down by the Johns Manville, but that's long gone too. So down almost over to the Hudson Bridge. Then there was the Nashua City Station right down here in Railroad Square. There was the Otteson Street Station on the so-called Acton branch. There was the Hollis Street Station on the Worcester, Nashua, and Portland line. The back part of that station became the back part of the Yankee Flyer Diner, which some of you may remember. And there was also one more station down at South Nashua, opposite, or on the tracks, opposite where the Little Red Schoolhouse, the cemetery is nowadays. And I'm told that there was a station there only because someone of the B&M magnates had a house in the neighborhood and didn't want to go to the trouble of coming into downtown to take the train to Boston. So they had a station there. My father, as I said, worked in the textile mills as an electrician, electrical engineer. And as I was growing up, he told me that don't stay in Nashua and don't work in a textile mill. Well, I disobeyed him because by the time I had finished college and was looking for work, the textile mills were closed. Sanders Associates had come to town and was occupying the old Indian Head Mill on Canal Street. So I broke both of his rules. I stayed in Nashua and I worked in an old textile mill. Mentioning my father, I want to go back a little further to some of the stories that he told me about coming to Nashua literally 100 years ago. He arrived in Nashua somewhere around 1910. As the chief electrical engineer of the Nashua Light, Heat, and Power Company, which was the local utility in those days. And he knew nothing about Nashua when he was offered the job, so he thought he'd ask his grandfather, my great-grandfather, who was a East Boston shipbuilder going back to the clipper ship days. He went to his grandfather and said, I've had this offer of a job up in Nashua, New Hampshire, and I know nothing about the place. Grandfather said, well, sure, I know all about Nashua. I used to go up and buy all my ship timber, oak, hackmatack, ship's knees, and so forth, from Luther Roby in Nashua. So father said, oh, okay, maybe it's a good place to go. So he came up here. And the first thing that he encountered was Canal Street. Apparently he got off the train at the Union Station, walked up Canal Street to downtown, or perhaps, and I'll get to downtown on that one in a minute, perhaps to the powerhouse of the Nashua Light Heat and Power, which was on Warren Street. Anyhow, his first reaction of Nashua was that the principal street, which he thought Canal Street was lined with saloons and some ladies that might not possibly be up to any good. Anyhow, he took a room at the Tremont House, which was on Main Street, where the Second National Bank, TD Bank, is now. And the next morning, went down to have breakfast and said he'd have some shredded wheat. So the waiter brought him some shredded wheat, and Father broke open the biscuit, and a cockroach stepped out. To which the waiter said, "Did you see something, sir?" The story about the Nashua Light Heat and Power Company, it generated all Nashua's power in those days except for what the mill, the Nashua Manufacturing Company and some of the other mills generated. But it was primarily the source of Nashua's power. And then, and perhaps still now, the peak load for a utility is Christmas week, the darkest period of the year, lots of Christmas lights. Some utilities are now seeing the summer air conditioner load system greater, but back in the 1900s, the period I'm talking about, the peak load was Christmas week. So Father and some of his crew were down at the powerhouse a couple of days before Christmas in the evening, watching all 3 steam turbines running flat out. The guys in the boiler room shoveling coal as fast as they could, and they were totally loaded up. One of the men said to my father, "You know, George, they turn on another damn Christmas light in this city, we're going down." The utility, Nashua Light Heat and Power, was owned locally, and a lot of the local magnates owned a big chunk of it. So when they had a problem, needless to say, they called the power company and said, "We got some lights out, we've got a problem, we got this problem, we've got that problem." And since they were the big guns that owned the company, of course, they couldn't send just an ordinary person. The chief engineer had to go and fix whatever the problem was. Which brings me to the story about the house on Concord Street with a turntable. That's the house that more recently was Mount St. Mary's Seminary, but in the days we're talking about belonged to Frank Anderson, who was a shoe magnate, Moody, Estabrook, and Anderson on Palm Street. And Mr. Anderson, as I say, owned a chunk of Nashua Light Heat and Power. In his youth, before he got into the shoe business, he had been a machinist. So got a call one day down at the powerhouse that Mrs. Anderson's battery charger for her electric car had something wrong with it. Well, of course, nothing would do, but the chief engineer had to go and see what the problem was. So Father went up to Concord Street to the Anderson mansion, which, by the way, later on belonged to another shoe magnate, Francis Murphy of J.F. McElwain, and later governor of New Hampshire. Anyhow, Father got there and went into the stable, garage, and so forth, which had a turntable in it, so you didn't have to back out of the garage or anything. You just turned the car around and drove out. And it even had a little machine shop in the back corner of it where you could do work and so forth. So Father fixed the battery charger. Apparently there wasn't much of any problem with it. And he turned to an old gentleman who was fiddling with a lathe in the back corner of the place and said, "Tell Mr. Anderson that his wife's battery charger is fixed." To which the old gentleman swiveled at him and said, "Boy, I am Frank Anderson."
I turned that thing around.
You did?
Yes, that
Turntable?
Harrington house. In my day, somehow, because we used to play basketball in that barn in the back.
Oh, well, maybe there were 2 of them. Maybe there were 2 houses with turntables.
I think there was only one.
Oh, well,
What are you talking about? Where the
yeah.
was
Yeah,
after.
yeah.
But it was a Harrington house.
Well,
We're talking 70 years ago.
well, it may, from Anderson to Murphy, there may have been somebody in between.
Well, that was the governor that lived there. That
Yeah.
was Governor Murphy on
Right.
the corner.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we're all talking about the same house then.
Yeah.
Once upon a time, Nashua had the biggest ice refrigerator factory in the world down on Bridge Street, the main manufacturing company. The main manufacturing had offices as far afield as Melbourne, Australia, down in Texas, San Francisco, shipped ice refrigerators all over the world. And the proprietor of the main manufacturing company was I. Frank Stevens. Isaac Frank Stevens, always known as I. Frank. The factory, or his office rather, had a light in it that blinked every time a refrigerator came off the assembly line. And if the light wasn't blinking pretty regularly, Mr. Stevens went charging out into the plant to find out what was wrong. Stevens built what I think is probably still the biggest house in Nashua, the house on the corner of Berkeley and Beeson Street with a pond out back. And of course that whole section of Nashua from Layton Street up to Greeley Park and from Concord Street to the river was once upon a time the Layton Farm, hence Layton Street and so forth. And the Layton heirs sold off lots there for 75 years. And Abby Layton, whom I knew as a young man when she was quite an old lady, told me that the pond behind that house had once been the piggery pond. That was the pig farm part of the Layton operation. Now, of course, it's quite an ornament to that part of the neighborhood, and kids go skating there and so on. But in any case, Mr. Stevens was the refrigerator king, and as I say, had by far the largest ice refrigerator factory in the world. Another local enterprise was the Nashua Saddlery Hardware Company, later the Nashua Brass Company, which eventually I believe was merged or sold out to Bronzecraft. Nashua Saddlery Hardware belonged to the Beeson family, who was a very prominent family in those days, and also one of the magnates who owned a big chunk of the Nashua Light Heat and Power Company. Well, Mr. Beeson one day called and said that his electric bill was outrageous and he wanted it looked into. So once again, the chief engineer went over to the Nashua Saddlery Hardware to look into the situation there and look at the meters and so forth. Well, when he arrived, the superintendent said, you come over to look at the meters and so forth? Father said yes. And the superintendent said, look, there's no problem with the meters. The old man can't get it through his head we're running a second shift. Another one of my father's stories, I don't know which church this was, one of the Catholic parishes in Nashua, but the confessional booth was on one level, and immediately above it was some sort of a platform where the electric meters were located. So one day, Father and a helper were inspecting the meters in the church, and they're in the platform above the confessional booth, and presumably looking at wiring diagrams or studying the situation. In other words, not making any noise, when the good Father and a penitent came in and started to hear confession. This was very embarrassing because both my father and his helper were active Masons, and they didn't know what to do, so they sat there very quietly until the confession was over, and always afterwards told the story about how two Masons heard confession in a Catholic church. See how we're doing, okay. One story, I'll go back to some of my younger days. As I've said, I grew up in a household where if you didn't know how to change fuses and do wiring and so forth, you were in big trouble. Well, I did learn, and that led me in the end of my junior year in high school to get a job at the Balsams Hotel up in Dixville Notch, New Hampshire, where I worked for the next 7 or 8 years. And in the spring of 1950, the second year I was there, I helped build what is now the ballot room. You watch the First in the Nation election returns, and you see the room with, they come in at midnight and they're collecting the ballots, and there's, make quite a thing about it. And for years, this is a sidebar to that story, for years the guy presiding at the ballot box was an older gentleman with Ben Franklin type glasses and sort of a lumber jacket and so forth. And the TV would always say, going to vote again? And the old gent would, putting on his best New Hampshire accent, better than I can do, said, oh yeah, we get here, we get out here at midnight and we just cast our ballots and then we go home and so forth. And as far as the TV people were concerned, and I'm sure practically every viewer in the nation said, oh, a fine old Yankee from up in the North Country probably works cutting pulp in the woods in the wintertime. The old gent in question was Neil Tillotson, who owned the hotel, the Tillotson Rubber Company, rubber plantations in Guatemala, half the Boston waterfront, and was a multimillionaire. But he also did a very clever thing. He would always kind of move sidewise so that the TV cameras would have to swivel a little bit so that there was a big Balsams Hotel logo on the wall, and he would move so that they couldn't, if they wanted to stay focused on him, they had to pick up the hotel ad too. In any case, I helped build that ballot room in 1950. It was not built as a ballot room. It was not built for anything except a gambling casino. That and an adjoining room had roulette tables, slot machines, crap tables, the whole works, the whole business of a small Las Vegas type casino. And it was operated by the Havana branch of the Mafia, who had cut a deal that when there was not much action in Cuba in the summertime, the northern New England resorts were their territory. So they had this thing built, and it lasted for 2 years until the state police came roaring in one night, raided the place, ripped everything off the wall, including the light fixtures. I had to go in the next morning and straighten out the short circuits and so forth. Carted the whole works back to Concord, and that was the end of illegal casino gambling in New Hampshire, at least in Dixville Notch. So, I think I've babbled on here for about half an hour. I'd entertain questions, comments, what have you. Yes, sir.
What do you remember about Benson's Wild Animal Farm?
Okay. I certainly went there several times. One of the things that I particularly remember about it was the jungle train. You remember that? The B&M used to run an excursion train from North Station up to Hudson. In those days, there was still a little chunk of the Worcester, Nashua, and Portland, the branch that ran across the bridge. If you go over to Hudson now and look to your right downstream, there's some piers in the river. That used to have a railroad bridge on it. And the train would come up to Nashua and switch through the freight yard at the south end, go across the river, and you could go to Benson's. And I remember seeing in North Station these big posters showing lions and tigers and elephants leaping out of the jungle and so forth. Take the jungle train to Benson's Wild Animal Farm. And so that's my principal recollection. What are yours?
Oh, I went there when I was a kid, and everybody for 100 miles around here remembers something about Benson's Wild Animal Farm. And I know that I'm well aware of the trains that used to come up and bring the animals up. And I do remember a story, a gentleman named Bob Lovejoy, who lives up in Litchfield. His mother used to live at the park, and she was the manager. And when the rodeos used to do their circuits, Boston was the last station on the circuit. They go around the country. So they'd have Broncos and Brahma bulls and whatever that had sort of worn out, and they would bring them up to Benson's and they'd use them to feed the carnivores. But when Bob was a boy and his mother lived on the farm, they used to go down to a certain spot at Benson's and give the old Broncos one last ride. So,
Well, yes.
I have a little story about Benson's later on. My husband's fraternity brother and his children had come up to go to Benson's animal farm, and they were very excited. Of course, his children were about the ages of my children, so we all got in the car and we went out to Benson's. But my daughter, who was of a very independent mind, when we walked in, we only stayed for a few minutes, and she said, "I do not approve of how they're treating the animals, and I am going home. The rest of you all can certainly stay, but I'm going home. I'll be fine. I'll just walk from here." We all looked at each other. We knew there was no point in trying to persuade her, because she made up her mind to leave. She was leaving one way or another. And so, 2 fathers and 4 children trailing behind her, we went back to the car, and at least on that day, we didn't get to see Benson's animal farm.
Do you remember when Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus came to Nashua and set up their tent? 1940.
I remember it,
You remember that?
right by my place.
Okay, out what was once the fairgrounds, out
Right.
West Hollis Street. Yep. Yeah, I remember seeing the circus train crossing Main Street and heading.
That was right down where the meat place used to be.
Yeah.
They unloaded over there
Yeah.
on East Hollis Street.
Yeah.
That was a big event.
Oh boy, it sure was. Okay. Yes, Barbara.
What can you tell us about movie theaters in downtown Nashua?
Well, you're the expert on that subject. Well, we had at various times as many as 4. The 2 principal ones were the Daniel Webster and the Tremont, or the State and the Daniel Webster. They were more or less on opposite sides of Main Street. The Tremont, correct me if I'm wrong on this, the Tremont was where Martha's Exchange is now, and the State was on the other side in the, well, the building that's still got an arc of lights over the front of it.
You had the Colonial and the Park Theater.
I'm coming to those. Yeah, we had the Colonial further on down, which used the shell of what had once been the original Nashua High School, and they had an entrance through the stores on the in front there where there's a bunch of them there now. Can't think of which ones, but anyhow, and the Colonial at one time had not only movies, but had vaudeville acts and things like that. And then there was the Park Theater, which was down at the corner of Park Street, and was in an old church building, and there was a hardware store on the first floor, and that whole thing burned somewhere in the 1950s, if I recall correctly. And that was probably the least reputable theater in town. Amongst the juvenile delinquents of whom I was a part, it was generally referred to as the Scratch House, because we all believed that there were bed bugs and other vile creatures there.
They had a mezzanine upstairs.
Oh yeah.
That was the only one, though.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have recollections of riding Betsy the Elephant when I was a child, which was quite an adventure. And also, you talked about the street lighting in Nashua. I recall the Warren Street. Probably remember. Those schools today, if the street lights go on,
Yeah,
all right? And you come in and the street lights go on, and then,
yeah,
well, Warren Street, they had these bays and these big switches, and there was Main Street, Hollis Street, Kisley Lake, and every one of them was a switch that would be turned on to light up, and Bay Street was called the White Way.
yeah.
So it's like today, not a possibility, but back then, that's how the electric lighting system worked.
Yeah, they were series
Yeah.
street lights.
Series
wire.
Series,
yeah.
yes. And I can remember as a kid, shouldn't say this, with the BB gun going out and breaking them. And what would happen is a big glow of light would come out, and the reason for that is because those are high voltage lights.
Yeah.
They were series, and when they would melt, so I was a juvenile doing it also. Also attended the park.
I remember two things about that. One, by the time I was in high school, we lived in an apartment on Auburn Street right over here, and laying in bed, I could see the street light outside my window, and so I would lay there peering out the window on a snowy or a bad day. Come on, light, come on, come on, come on. And sometimes it would, and sometimes it wouldn't. Well, when they finally stopped doing that, this was well after I was grown up, I remember telling my mother that you can't tell about school keeping or not by the streetlights anymore because they're all self-turning on. And she said, that's not possible. She had not listened to my father enough.
You had mentioned also the turntable. Quite a few years ago, I acquired a piece of property at the corner Chestnut and Hollis Street. It was St. Pierre's Jewelry Store.
Yeah,
Well, in the back, there's a two-stall garage. And in the garage, there's a turntable on the floor that was used for horse. When they brought the carriage in, they would turn turntable around. And I found it quite unique. I said, what is this? I went underneath the cellar. I said, wow, my goodness gracious. Talk about technology in the old days.
yes, ma'am.
I've only been here 15 years, so do me the honor of telling me where the oldest house is and the oldest cemetery is.
Probably the oldest cemetery is the one down on the DW Highway South, although I understand that there were some burials up in the area where Greeley Park is now, back in colonial times, but they're all unmarked and nobody knows where or who is there. But the oldest one that's identifiable is down on DW Highway South. And of course, that's got the little brick schoolhouse in it. And one of my junior high school English teachers, as a very young woman, had taught at that one-room school. And she lived, I think, up in Hopkinton and was able in those days on early Monday morning to take the train from Hopkinton into Concord, down to Nashua, get off at the South Nashua station, and get to the schoolhouse where one of the big boys had already started a fire in the stove and pumped some water from the well and brought it in. The other question, the oldest house. I think there's some dispute about that. There's a house down at more or less at the junction of East Dunstable Road, Lund Road, and the Turnpike and so forth, that's set way back that some people have told me is the oldest house. There's another one, another very old house up here just off Concord Street, Davis Court, called the Haunt. It's been over the years an antique shop and residence and so forth. But that was built in Hollis and moved over here. And curiously, my wife, who knew nothing about Nashua until she met me, but she has far more Nashua ancestors than I do, and it turns out that house was built by one of her ancestors.
What about the one up on Pine Hill Road? I thought there was the oldest one, according to one article, was up going towards where the man who owns the bowling alley, who just died up by his house, up past the airport on the right. There's some road.
question is, off Pine Hill Road is one of the oldest houses in the city up there.
Past the airport.
Past the airport, and I have to say I'm not familiar with that. I can't answer your question. The two that I mentioned are the ones that would immediately come to my mind as the oldest houses. Yes, sir?
Speaking of the airport, do you remember going in?
I do indeed. That was what, I think 1935, 36? Yes, it was the day or the week that it opened. My parents, well, I won't go into that story, but we wound up going up to the airport to see what was going on, and the two famous flyers at the time, Clarence Chamberlain and Ruth Nichols, were taking up passengers in a Fokker trimotor, not a Ford, but a Fokker, 3-engine aircraft with one in the nose and so forth. And I think it was 50 cents a ride. And this is the middle of the Depression, and my folks had just had a very bad day financially for some reason. But they said, gee, we've still got $1.50, let's go for an airplane ride. So we all got on the airplane, and I was obviously about 4 years old, 4 or 5 years old at the time. And Ruth Nichols patted me on the head and said I was the youngest passenger of the day. And when we finished the flight and got out of the airplane and so forth, I grabbed my father's sleeve, and I do remember this. Dad, I want to go again and go higher.
You talked a little bit about the 38 hurricane. Were there any other major disasters that you know of in the city that really affected the community that you can recall?
Yeah, I can think of a lot of disasters, but I won't name them. Almost before my recollection, I'm not sure that I remember it or not, the 1936 flood, when the water was up to the level on Canal Street, up to the first floor windows in what's now the BAE building. And I sort of have a recollection of being taken to the top of the hill by the big stone church on Chandler Street and looking down and seeing a rowboat going along Canal Street. I'm not sure whether I really remember that or not, but I certainly recall it. Power was out, the gas works were flooded, the railroad station was flooded. Yeah, that was a good disaster. In terms of economic disasters, I've indicated the National Manufacturing Company closing was just beyond belief in terms of the impact on the city.
Do you recall the train derailment on Union Square, Union Station?
Which?
The train derailment on Union Station?
Oh yeah, very much so. That was in '57. Yeah, that was when the B&M was still running trains, passenger trains. And the train coming down, I'm not sure if White Road Junction or Concord, but it came into the Nashua Union Station way too fast, came across the bridge and jumped the tracks, and the first section of the locomotive went right up onto the platform and ended up in the baggage room of the station. The other section of the locomotive flopped over into the Johns Manville property. Several cars were overturned. Wheel carriages were scattered all over the place. I think at least one person was killed. And
Taylor. I think his last name was Taylor.
that could be, yeah. And the thing that I went down, I happened to be in town at the time, and as it so happened wasn't working. So I went down to see what was going on, and I think one of the more impressive things, because I love old machinery, the wrecking cranes that the B&M sent up from Billerica were steam-powered, probably at the time 80 years old, and watching them lift the wrecked cars up off the tracks and so forth was just fascinating. Let's see, other disasters. Well, I can't think of any offhand.
What about the armory fire?
Okay, that was, I wouldn't put that in the category of a huge disaster, but it was spectacular. The armory was on Canal Street, right next to the Unitarian Universalist Church where their White Wing School building is now. And the fire started on a Sunday morning when we were all gathering for church. And the church nearly burned down too. And the fire department did a spectacularly good job of putting up a water curtain between the burning armory and the church. And a committee was formed by the church almost literally out in the street while the fire was still going to buy the property from the state if we could.
The Woolworth fire was a big deal.
Yeah, yep, on Main Street.
Yeah.
Yep.
And because that's what widened Main Street.
Yeah. Some of you may remember what used to be called the bottleneck, where there was a curved building. It went by various names. The Montcalm building, I think, was the one at the time. And Main Street sort of narrowed and then widened out again as it got to the bridge. And so some of the buildings there burned, and that enabled Main Street to be widened to where it is now. Yeah.
I promised that I would ask where the roundhouse was and why they decided to take it out. What's there now?
I'm sorry?
The roundhouse for the turning around of the engines?
Oh, at the railroad roundhouse?
Yes.
Okay. All that's left of that is one segment, which I guess Corvo Ruthia uses. It's on the left side of Bridge Street, I guess it would be, as you go down. But once upon a time, there was a big roundhouse there with probably a dozen or 15 stalls and a turntable in front of it, and a water tower and a coaling station for servicing the steam locomotives. I certainly do remember that. In fact, for a long time, there was a morning train that originated in Nashua, started down here at what once had been the city station, right down here in Railroad Square. And the locomotive and the cars stayed overnight down by the old roundhouse. And the locomotive would just sit there totally untended. And I remember several of us being sorely tempted to get up into the cab of that locomotive or do something, but we never quite dared to do it. So that train would leave Railroad Square, it was a commuter train to Boston, would leave Railroad Square first thing in the morning and come back as a commuter train in the afternoon. Yes?
During one of the walks with Alan Minoyan, we were by that little building that Doris McCustis had that was a police station, and you know what I mean, down on Railroad Square.
Yeah.
And he talked about a scale that is in the ground there that they used to run the trains over to weigh the items going on.
I think the scale, you're talking about the little brick house?
Yeah.
Okay. The scale is right next to that. The trains didn't go on it. That was a coal company, and that was where they weighed the carts of coal. I'm trying to remember whether that was Shed or Layton's coal company. There were 2 or 3 coal companies, coal and coke companies in Railroad Square, and that was the office of one of them. And the scale, it's still there, probably isn't functional at all, but that was where they weighed the coal. The truck would drive on. The truck was already weighed. They'd load the coal, and you got billed by the amount of coal. And going back to the Stevens house up at Concord and Beeson Street, not Concord, Berkeley Street, one of I. Frank Stevens' sons, I. Blaine Stevens, who I knew again as a young man, he being an old man, told me that his father used to have 85 tons of coal put in there every winter for heating and another 15 tons for the kitchen stoves. And since he had nice lawns and gardens, not 1 pound of that coal could be driven in a truck or a cart across the lawn. It was all lugged 1 bag at a time into the cellar. Who else? Okay.
What was your connection to the Tamulonis farm?
The Tamulonis?
The Tamulonis farm down on East Dunstable.
Well, there was down there, as you make the bend on East Dunstable Road, there was a chicken farm. I don't know the names who had the farms, but there was a chicken farm there, and as you started up the hill on the left, there was a big barn. There was a dairy farm, and I can remember seeing cows being driven across the road from the barn to a field on the other side. And that whole area was either woods or fields. Again, I do not know who owned the farm. That was a little far afield. I got down there on the bicycle, but I didn't know the people. Speaking of that part of the city, this is, I think, a good story, and then I'll shut up again. In 1940, the Army had held maneuvers down in the south end, the then wilderness, uninhabited part of Nashua, from Fort Devens. And the horse cavalry was still active, and so they were there, the cavalry was there with their horses, and the old cavalry sergeants paid the kids. I tried to do this and couldn't manage it, I wasn't strong enough. A penny a bucket to bring a big galvanized pail of water from Salmon Brook up to where the horses were being kept. And so I thought that was a good deal. And so I tried to lug one of those cavalry watering buckets. I couldn't do it. So I had a better idea along with another kid. We went downtown to a wholesale candy dealer and bought a load of Hershey bars and Milky Way bars and such like, and took them down and sold them to the troops.
I had heard that some of the small buildings on the Pine Hill Avenue side of the airport were barracks for the Army Air Corps during the war. Is that true?
The barracks, there were some barracks there just beyond the brick hangar along by the brook there. And I don't know if the Army Air Corps used them in World War II, but they were built as transient housing during the Depression for people. We didn't have any Okies here, but there were still people who were on the road without a job, no place to stay, and so forth. And those buildings were built originally as transient housing for, I guess we'd call them displaced people nowadays. Yes?
Across from the shopping area that used to have the Rosimex supermarket in it, I was walking one day and was very surprised to see that there was a wooden floor right outside. There were no sides or anything. There was just a wooden floor. And I was told, I heard some water moving.
Yeah.
And I was told that somehow the water goes from wherever the source was under the road and under the parking lot. And that's why the parking lot down there is kind of,
Yeah.
Why?
Well, that was a mill pond once upon a time. The Gardner Beardsall Company, who made shoe counters, had some factories at the other end of that area. They went out of business somewhere in my childhood, so I don't know too much about them. But Salmon Brook came down through there. It came under the building that there's now a little park there, the Rotary Park, and that building was the International Paper Box Machine Company, and they had a 25 kilowatt generator in their basement and made electricity there. And then the brook fell still further through some water wheels for the Gardner Beardsall Shoe Counter Company further on down. And then when that all stopped, that whole area was filled in. And actually, it was filled in, if you went down Main Street in those days, past, I don't know what they call it now, Seminole Plaza, Rosimex, all that area. There were a whole row of fine houses, buildings on a high bank, which has got all cut down, and the dirt from that was used to fill in that mill pond. And yeah, there is water running through there. That's Salmon Brook. No salmon in it anymore, though.
It's a very strange sensation to see a wooden floor
Yeah.
outside, no building, just the wooden floor.
Yeah.
And then hear the water.
Yeah. Of course, we used to go swimming in Salmon Brook, too. And in fact, somebody asked me the other day about the Mill Canal and swimming there. And yeah, I never went there, but there were all along the Mill Canal off Perry Avenue in that area, there were a whole series of swimming places, and they were very ethnic. There was the place where the Polish people, Lithuanians, the Greeks, the French, what have you, all went swimming in their particular spot in the canal. And the big deal, as I understand it, was to float down the canal and walk back, because there was a very strong current in the canal. And it's hard to imagine swimming in that Nashua River water in the 1940s, but we did, they did. I never did that. Not that I was so damn virtuous, I just didn't happen to get over to that part of the city. Yes?
It's an interesting coincidence. I was going to ask a question about ethnic groups. There are places like French Hill, of course, that have an ethnic name. There are ethnic cemeteries throughout. Could you say something about the different ethnic groups and their significance to Nashua?
Yeah. The first ethnic group of any significance was probably the Irish, who came to help. According to what I've read and heard, believe me, it's before my time, they walked up from Lowell to work on digging the Mill Canal that comes through Mine Falls Park, and walked back again in the evening. And then probably the next group that came in, conveniently because of the train service by the 1850s, down from Canada, would be the French Canadians. And then later on, the Greeks, some degree Lithuanians and Poles. Nashua never had any significant Italian or community. The Greeks came in to work in the mills and in the shoe shops. So we had virtually every ethnic group, can't seem to say the word right, except Italians. But it was a fair Italian group that went to Milford to work in the granite quarries there. Nashua did have a granite quarry, that's why Ledge Street has its name. That was the Nashua Manufacturing Company's granite quarry. Yes?
Did Nashua have a poor farm?
Yes.
Where was it?
Well, that was something that amused my father very greatly. The poor farm is what's now the Nashua Country Club. And Father used to quite cynically say, oh, I hear so-and-so is down at the poor farm today. But that was indeed the Nashua Poor Farm until the city decided that they didn't need it, and a group decided it would be a good place to have a golf course. I can go on for almost indefinitely, but some of you may want to go home.
Amherst Street used to be a big farmland, wasn't it?
What?
Amherst Street.
Amherst Street was, oh, absolutely.
All farms.
I certainly very well remember when it was practically wall-to-wall poultry farms. And there was a roller skating rink up there, the Jack-o'-lantern, some of you may even remember that. And up at Round Pond, which has now got industrial development and so forth all around it, the Round Pond Ice Company cut ice there. I remember very well when ice wagons still delivered ice all over town. There was the Balcom Ice Company, which cut on Sandy Pond, Sandy Pond Ice Company, which cut up at Sandy Pond, and when the ice wagon came around, we sometimes would follow it and see if we could get a chip of ice to chew on and do things like that. Of course, we had the ice man, the milk man, the egg man, the paper man, and the mailman. Well, we still have mailmen, but and the garbage man, yeah. Came around, collected garbage for a pig farm.
Butter lady.
Well, we didn't have a butter lady.
Coal man?
What's that?
Deliver the coal?
Oh, and of course, coal, yeah. Although at our house, we allowed the truck to back up on the lawn. And
Do you recall a fishing tournament at Sandy Pond?
A what?
Fishing tournament at Sandy Pond.
Nope.
Having lived in the neighborhood with 3 or 4 years, they had them there in the 50s.
No,
Sandy Pond was probably twice the size that it is now.
Yeah.
It's been filled in.
Yeah, I remember it's being bigger, but I didn't know anything about fishing there. Well, thank you all for your interest and attention.